the sports world or college football world, we've got caught up in some rumors, salacious things, reality television. I don't know what you want to call it or whatever, but Oklahoma quarterback John Mateer, his Venmo payments from 3 years ago were dug up actually by a quote unquote fake reporter by the name of Brian Aguada. I might be misspelling that or mispronouncing that name, but it doesn't matter because he doesn't exist. Originated this on Twitter and it spread like wildfire. That John Mateer sent some payments to a former teammate at Washington State back in 2022 that were labeled as sports gambling. Well, of course, this spread like wildfire on social media. It didn't take long for people to start going, oh boy, he's breaking rules and everything. And then a little less than 24 hours later, John Mateer finally responded to these accusations that he was gambling because, of course, that's against NCAA rules and players can lose at the very least 50% of their eligibility for the upcoming season if they are found guilty of gambling on their own sport. So he released this statement, which we're going to show for you here on the screen. He said, "The allegations that I once participated in sports gambling are false. My previous Venmo descriptions did not accurately portray the transactions in question, but were instead inside jokes between me and my friends. I have never bet on sports. I understand the seriousness of the matter, but recognize that, taken out of context, those Venmo descriptions suggest otherwise. I can assure my teammates, coaches, and officials at the NCAA that I have not engaged in any sports gambling." So, OU also released a statement saying, they're aware of everything. They're looking at it. But right now, nothing's come of it. We know the NCAA isn't necessarily investigating any of this. I talked to someone, a very well-placed source that said that the U.S. Integrity system, which monitors gambling across college athletics for a lot of these conferences, they told me that John Mateer's name never came up over the last several years. So where do we stand on this? And also, just what are your thoughts? Can anything come of this? Will anything come of this? Is this something that's going to be shadowing over John Mateer as they get ready for their season opener here in a couple of weeks?
Well, I think one piece of this that we have to get into is let's say that this is real. Let's say that he gambled with a friend. How do you prove that? Right? All we have in terms of evidence is a random screenshot. So ultimately, unless one of the two people involved in this come out and say this was gambling, it's impossible to prove. If I gamble with Brandon and I hand him a $10 bill, there's no paper trail, right? There's no investigation to be had. So ultimately, that's why I think that this can't really go anywhere. Oklahoma said, we're not aware of any investigation against him by the NCAA. I don't think that there's enough evidence to make something like that happen. So let's get that out of the way first. I don't think that there's realistically going to be any sort of investigation, any sort of suspension, anything like that. This is such an indicator of this new world that we live in, where every tiny thing is going to be put under scrutiny in a different kind of way. It's kind of funny, frankly, that Venmo payments are as public as they are after the John Mateer situation. People found screenshots of all sorts of other college football players with, hilarious captions dating back 4 or 5 years of sending, money to players or whatever like that, right? And so I don't think it's ultimately going to matter, but this is the last thing that Oklahoma needs, is another distraction, is another thing hanging over, another moment for John Mateer to not be focused on his most important job, which is going out and winning football games.
Shehan, you and I went back and forth yesterday kind of texting each other about who had or hadn't said anything regarding the situation, right? You talk about the principals involved. His former teammate at Washington State, when they both were at Washington State, now that former teammate is at Abilene Christian University. And Abilene isn't saying anything either. So if nobody's saying anything, you don't really have much. I do think the statement in general is really quite interesting because, again, the Venmo transaction in question says sports gambling, UCLA versus USC, the day after UCLA played USC. I believe it was the fall of 2022. So I understand we all have knucklehead inside jokes with our friends that we may put in Venmo citations, but I don't really get what the inside joke is if the game was quite literally the day after or the day before you made the Venmo transaction. So that is one thing that we do need to discuss. If you're somebody who's in the public eye, like a John Mateer, you have to make all of these things private. I mean, and the one thing that Brandon was kind of talking about that I think is interesting, you mentioned U.S. integrity in kind of a roundabout way. U.S. integrity doesn't have a ton to do with this because John Mateer didn't actually use, apparently, a FanDuel or a DraftKings or an official betting app. Sports gambling, online sports wagering was not legal in the state of Washington, is not legal in the state of Washington at the time that these Venmo transactions happened. And that's kind of the funny thing about this. If he would have used a FanDuel or DraftKings, he would have been caught a la the Iowa State players, that they found all of that stuff with the Iowa State athletes. I believe it was a couple years ago, but it's hard, as Shehan's saying, to prove this when it's just something like a Venmo transaction. And I basically think that's the gauntlet that both Oklahoma and Mateer are throwing down, John.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off what you're saying there, Richard, because I think you make a really interesting point about the statement in general. And I agree with what everybody's saying here. I think it's unlikely there are any serious repercussions for John Mateer or Oklahoma here, just because the burden of proof is really high. But specifically, when you make definitive statements, as he did, all it takes is one person to disprove it, and all of a sudden you're pointed out as a liar. So when he says, I have never bet on sports, little John Mateer might have had an 8th grade friend that they bet $5 Cowboys games, and now he's a liar. So that to me is, when you're that strong in a statement, you better be right. Because again, I've never engaged in sports gambling. I've never bet on sports. That's very strong. And again, everybody grows up differently, but like, I remember being in middle school doing March Madness pools, and we'd put $5-10 on them. Guess what? I was gambling on sports back then. So I find it a little unlikely. Maybe it's just conspiracy John that thinks there might be some stretching of the truth in that statement. But that's something that I think could pop up down the line. Do we really care? I don't know. But I just think that's the statement. The wording is interesting.
No, and I don't think that we ultimately will care. I will tell you. So John Mateer grew up not far from where I live right now. He was in Little Elm, a town outside of Frisco. And that area, Denton and Collin County, are in very close proximity to Oklahoma and the casinos right across the border, right? Now, you don't typically do sports gambling there, but like you said, the statement maybe even is a little stronger than it needs to be. Because here's the reality, right? Is that the problem with this right now is that he was a Pac-12 quarterback allegedly gambling on a Pac-12 game against teams that he might have played against. By the way, that game was the 48-45 thriller between USC and UCLA. Tremendous game. Caleb Williams and Dorian Thompson-Robinson going in that one. A second straight episode with the Dorian Thompson-Robinson mention. How about that? But what he needs to say and prove ultimately is that there is no evidence that can corroborate any of this. And ultimately now, again, unless more evidence comes to the forefront, I don't think that anybody's going to be running through John Mateer's past. I don't think that the NCAA is going to send enforcement to Little Elm to go look through his drawers or anything like that. So for now, keep your nose clean, stay out of trouble. And again, this is the last thing that Oklahoma needs, is to have to worry about something like this.
Well, I think the last thing they need is John Mateer to go down with injury. But here's the thing: that if I was John Mateer, you might as well have just said, "Prove it," because you can't prove it. If it was just a transaction between your teammates,
don't challenge them. Don't challenge them.
You can label it whatever you want or whatever. But how do you know that it was actually me betting on a game? There's no platform to show that I was betting on a game. What I was betting on, for that matter, was I betting on the spread? Was I betting on the total points? I mean, prove it. They don't have anything concrete here. Even I think if they did some digging, unless his teammate just straight up says, "Hey, yeah, he's betting, and by the way, there's a lot more where that comes from." In the end, this is going to end up, I think, my opinion, going to be a nothing burger.
Yeah, and look, I do think we all understand that sports betting is absolutely ubiquitous. It is certainly not going anywhere. But if you are an athlete, you cannot bet on sports, much less literally your own sport, against opponents in your league that you may play. I'm not zero sum, zero tolerance on a lot of things in life, but this is one I am. If you are an athlete, you cannot bet. you just can't do it, at least
It's an
on
integrity
sports.
thing. If the integrity of the game is compromised, the entire business model of the game is compromised, right? And like, again, I think sports writers can get a little highfalutin about things, but like this is one of those things where it's like, no, if people don't trust that college football is a real sport, then like it isn't a real sport, right? Like it isn't something that you can build billion-dollar partnerships on and all this sort of stuff, right? So no, 100%. If there's gambling, it needs to be snuffed out. I'm hopeful, frankly, big picture, that some of these enforcement cases create that level of, I guess, warning to college athletes. But like you said, Richard, this isn't one of those things where it's like, well, everybody else can gamble. It's no big. No, I mean, this is a big deal because they are the actual participants that are on the field.
I honestly
Yeah, I
think
mean,
the
as people have, yeah, go ahead, John. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, I think honestly the biggest impact of this is that it's going to be a PSA to athletes and agents everywhere: make your Venmo private. Make your Venmo private. And I think we went through this in the past of Twitter when everyone was digging up what athletes did at 13 or whatever, and like I think people learned, all right, I'm going to clear out my Twitter before I make it to the big leagues. Like, you just got to be careful. I learned this lesson. I once had an ex find out I was dating someone new based on a public Venmo transaction. Made them all private a couple years ago.
Come
I learned my
on,
lesson.
John. Come on.
I know. I didn't know. And then you find out you can make them private. And I've had it for a couple years now. So you got to keep the transactions private. Anybody can find you. And, listen, I love seeing Julian saying paid for a Minions movie a couple years ago. That was hilarious. But like, he probably doesn't need that out there. Clear him out. Make him private. That's
yeah. Here's the thing: which Minions movie? It really depends because there's a quality difference there. Here's the other thing. I mean, we've been hearing this for a decade or so, and I've had people tell me this in compliance offices. They're like, we know players are betting on sports. They might not be betting on their own sports, but we know they're doing it because they're teenagers or getting into their 20s, and also sports betting is much more part of the fabric and the culture now than it ever has been. I mean, everywhere you see it's on your TV screens while you're watching games. And now, of course, you can just pick up your phone and bet, making it much easier. This is a problem that's not going to go away, I fear. We're going to be hearing more things like this. People are going to be digging stuff up. And that's why a lot of these conferences, as we mentioned, have partnered up with folks like US Integrity to look at all this, right? So they can study it, look at some potential red flags that come up, but also, listen, we're in this era where, all it takes is for a player to be sitting around bored one night, or maybe they've had one too many things to drink, and they just go, hey, I'm going to check out this gambling app. And they end up pushing a button and they bet $5 on something. But I don't think this is going away. All right. But I think John Mateer's in the clear, in my opinion. I just don't see, unless they find something else outside of screenshots from his Venmo, it's interesting. But one last quick thing, and we're going to move on here real quick. This whole situation reminded me, I don't know if you guys remember the early 2000 teens. Remember Sports by Brooks? The screenshots and all that stuff. This is what that reminded me of. Like an intrepid reporter who's just on his own getting screenshots of something. I had some good memories of that, or should I say bad memories, while I was covering the Cam Newton stuff.